conversation of the composer and of the stage designer that there's actually some science here. This is actually about a locust, a real locust, the Rocky Mountain locust. And that science comes from, it's actually my wife being noisy back there. That science actually has been sort of investigated and looked for by Professor Jeff Lockwood from the university. Now, I first met Jeff when he was a professor of agriculture, and we were flying the 13-seater plane from Laramie to Denver, and we sat at opposite sides of the aisle. I was heading off to a national conference in some sort of plain vanilla kind of a place like Chicago. He was heading off to someplace in Africa, where he was going to advise them how to eradicate a locust plague that was taking place in that country. At the time, Jeff was a full-time entomologist, that means bug scientist, and he was an expert on grasshoppers and locusts, and in particular on preventing their depredation of plants. Now, fast forward a decade. Dr. Lockwood is no longer in agriculture. He's now the professor of natural sciences and humanities at UW, and by 2006, he had joined the philosophy department. Since then, he has taught regularly in philosophy, and in 2009, co-authored a book called Philosophical Foundations for the Practices of Ecology with botany professor Bill Reiners. A year later, even though he had moved away from full-time insect research, he wrote a book called Six-Legged Soldiers, the Use of Insects as Weapons of War. I happen to be a professor of religious studies, so I always enjoyed his opening chapter in which he interprets the insect life in the plagues in the book of Exodus. Jeff is also a creative writer, and he often teaches in UW's creative writing program, served as its chairman for several years, and he is frequently invited to serve as an author in residence in different places around the country. As one of his current projects, he has written 2 murder mysteries. Is there going to be a third? Third one on the way, based on a character called Riley the Exterminator. Today, he will speak on a subject based on his 2005 book, Locust, which looks at the rise and fall of the Rocky Mountain locust. And as we know, it was premiered as an opera last night, and we'll have another opportunity to see it today. So I will let Professor Lockwood speak on the Rocky Mountain locust.
So Paul reminds me of that airplane trip, which was the beginning of maybe the worst journey in my history as a scientist. It ended up I was headed to Eritrea, and the day before I was to arrive, the Ethiopians bombed Asmara, and it turns out they canceled flights during the bombing of airports, so the whole trip sort of dissolved. But in some ways, the complexity of international travel prepared me for the complexities of putting together an opera, which hopefully doesn't bomb. I think it actually went quite well. So, let me begin. Opera is a remarkable art form, having existed and adapted to a changing environment for more than 400 years. This synergistic combination of soliloquy, dialogue, costume, scenery, action, and music flourishes because, I think, there are 2 essential features. First, opera is grounded in the power of words, but it ultimately achieves its success via the supreme capacity of music to distill, to crystallize, and to intensify the meaning of words. Words, which are my artistic device, can evoke self-reflection, they can evoke rational analysis, but music elicits emotional reflection and transcendent feeling. Second, opera is rooted in archetypes who exemplify timeless human struggles. Carl Jung believed that universal mythic characters reside within the collective unconscious of the people the world over. Archetypes represent fundamental human motifs of our experience as we evolved, and consequently, they evoke deep emotions. Well, how does this all too brief account explain our motivation to develop an opera about an insect? The relationship between humanity and the natural world is perhaps the longest standing tension in the history of our species. Locusts tap into an ancient sense of dread among agricultural civilizations. These insects represent uncontrollable power, unimaginable vulnerability. Name the opera. Yes, with my special effects. These insects evoke a sense of our own capacity to shape the world and our existential insecurity on a planet that is changing around us. The Rocky Mountain locust provides an epic tale of a devastating ascendance and a mysterious disappearance, of the rise and fall of a biological empire. And here is their story, intertwined with our own history of courage and of fear. I'll tell you the story, and then I would like to conclude with a few words about the actual writing of the opera. The tiny, limp body had been violently mangled. Although the corpse had also begun to rot, it still retained distinguishing features and the essence of its original form. Having spent the last 4 years honing my forensic skills while searching for precisely these remains, I was able to identify the body as being that of Melanopus spretus, the Rocky Mountain locust, the only locust known to have existed in North America. This was the first incontrovertible specimen of this creature to be collected in nearly 100 years. Its extinction, which culminated in the early days of the 20th century, represented the loss of a continental scale process. No longer would this living conveyor belt distribute immense loads of organic material across the Great Plains. Consider that large swarms weighed thousands of tons and required 100,000 pounds of vegetation a day to stoke their metabolic fires. No longer would this eerie shadow sweep across the endless prairie and then give way to the papery rattle of billions, indeed trillions, of insects in flight. These events are still known on every other inhabited continent, but North America will never again experience the staggering scale of life in motion, the humbling sweep of fecundity, or a biological eclipse of the sun. After finding the first small body in the ice of northwestern Wyoming's Knife Point Glacier, my colleagues and I began an excited search for more, eventually recovering 130 largely intact remains. Each was cataloged, dried for preservation, and individually mounted for future study. On the last day at the glacier, we set a drift net in one of the hundreds of streams that rush down the face of the ice. In just 24 hours, we collected 140 fragmented remains of the Rocky Mountain locust. At this rate, more than 1 million corpses have melted from the glacier since that day in 1990, washing into Dinwiddie Creek and perhaps being carried to the Wind River. The icy grave had served as an effective, if somewhat brutal, final resting place. Based on radiocarbon dating and geological analyses, we surmised that as the first opera was being performed in Italy, and as the pilgrims were arriving at Plymouth, this swarm of Rocky Mountain locusts, originating from the river valleys that would one day become part of Yellowstone National Park, was being swept up the valley and blown onto the ice. Scattered across the glacier in a seething carpet of brown-green bodies, some of the locusts may have managed to escape and continue their journey, but millions were immobilized by the cold. In the course of summer melting, they were washed into the crevasses that split the top of the ice field. With time, they were frozen deep in the glacier and slowly transported down the side of the mountain until they came to a point 750 feet below the crevassed section. Here, the slope flattens abruptly, and the ice, in a slow-motion version of the rapids that form at the base of a waterfall, becomes turbulent, churning the embedded contents to the surface. Here, for the first time in 400 years, the locust emerged into the light. Although the swarm associated with these frozen bodies has long faded from memory, the Rocky Mountain locust is deeply embedded in the lore and culture of the American West. So let's begin the story of the Rocky Mountain locust in the period of the Old Frontier, an era in which new lands were being explored. From here, we can see how this creature came to shape the nation during a time of pioneers and farmers, miners and naturalists, a time during which a young country was trying to grasp the promises and perils of its frontier, a time in which the natural world was on a collision course with manifest destiny. This is the story of what happened, a powerful context for understanding what extinction means for humanity. With a voyeuristic eye, we can peek into the lives of the pioneers, reading from letters they sent back to family in the East. In July of 1874, Edwin Snyder of Highland, Kansas, penned a chilling description of a summertime blizzard transforming into a swarm of locusts. He wrote, "At our place, they commenced coming down about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, at first only one at a time, here and there, looking a little like flakes of snow, but acting more like the advanced skirmishers in an advancing army. Soon they commenced, coming thicker and faster, and they again were followed by vast columns, or bodies looking almost like clouds in the atmosphere. They came rattling and pattering on the houses and against the windows, falling in the fields, on the prairies, and in the waters, everywhere on everything. By about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, every tree and bush, buildings, fences, fields, roads, and everything except animated beings was completely covered with grasshoppers." We might be tempted to dismiss such pioneer tales as the stuff of legend and lore, but the federal government was reluctantly affirming the depth and breadth of the crisis. A U.S. Army major was dispatched to Nebraska in the fall of 1874 to assess the situation. His report to the Secretary of War revealed that in the most desperate precincts, 4 out of every 5 families was at risk of starvation in the coming winter. In the best circumstances, 1/3 of the people would require assistance. Although he was a veteran of the atrocious suffering of the Civil War, this battle-hardened officer was clearly moved by the plight of the settlers. He concluded his report with a plea for immediate action on the part of government to avert the impending disaster, writing that great suffering exists in all 5 of these extreme frontier counties to a fearful extent. The settlers are, in most instances, scattered over a large extent of country, a large portion of them living far up the numerous streams flowing into the Republican. If the winter should be as severe as that of 70 and 71, and as deep snows fall, beyond a doubt hundreds will starve unless a supply of provisions sufficient to last them through the winter is thrown into the valley and they are provisioned for an emergency of this character, for it would be out of the question for any aid society, or the government even, to reach anything like a majority of them in deep snows." As temperatures dropped and suffering mounted in early 1875, Congress took up the matter of the pioneers' plight in the bitterly cold days of winter. Lawmakers appropriated $150,000 for food and clothing, quote, "to prevent starvation and suffering to any and all destitute and helpless persons living on the western frontier, who have been rendered destitute and helpless by the ravages of grasshoppers." The Dakota, Missouri, and Platte departments of the Army participated in a massive relief effort. Almost 2 million food rations were distributed that winter. According to military records, the recipients amounted to 107,535 people, including nearly 44,000 children, in Colorado, Dakota, Iowa, Kansas, Minnesota, and Nebraska. How many graves were filled with emaciated victims of the locusts that winter is not known, but perhaps hundreds succumbed to hunger. The number would likely have been in the thousands if the country had not rallied to save the starving settlers. The suffering of the pioneers is most powerfully etched into the American mind by the writings of Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House on the Prairie. In the 4th book of this classic series, locusts devastate the family farm on the banks of Plum Creek, and the father is forced to leave his family behind to search for work. His journey echoes our culture's canonical story of a people wandering in the wilderness, seeking a promised land. Laura learns from her mother's reading of Scripture that locusts played a pivotal role in the time of the Egyptian pharaohs. And so the tale of the pioneers becomes interwoven with Western culture's most deep and abiding literary account of locusts. Perhaps the Wilders sensed that they were part of a great human migration, an American exodus across the continent. But what they did not know while watching their farm disappear under a blanket of locusts that summer was that no people on earth, not even a pharaoh, had ever witnessed a swarm of such immensity. Albert Child was a Renaissance man of the frontier. After practicing medicine and serving as a school superintendent in Ohio, he moved to Cedar Creek in Cass County, Nebraska to try his hand at farming. But Albert Child's real passion was not medicine, not education, not agriculture. No, he adored the science of meteorology. And as soon as he arrived in Nebraska in 1857, Dr. Child started keeping weather records. In 1861, he began providing reports to the Smithsonian Institution. His work was transferred to the U.S. Signal Corps when they took over as the country's weather service in 1873. By then, he'd been elected county judge and moved to Plattsmouth, but his love for meteorology was unabated. This is how Albert Child came to be the right man in the right place at the right time to provide a definitive report of the most immense swarm of locusts in recorded human history. He began his account with the objective tone of a trained and experienced observer, writing, "The extent of the swarm is difficult to ascertain as the observer can only see a small belt. They may extend indefinitely right or left. During the flight from June 15 to 25 of 1875, I telegraphed east and west. I found a continuous line moving northward of 110 miles, and then somewhat broken 40 miles farther. The movements of the wind for the 5 days averaged about 10 miles per hour, and the locust evidently moved considerably faster than the wind, at least 15 miles per hour. To determine the height of the swarm, he used a rather clever approach. Dr. Child focused his telescope on various objects of similar size to the locust placed at known distances across the rolling hills. Then he'd aim the instrument up into the sky, and if locusts were in focus, he could conclude the swarm must be at least as high as the horizontal distance that he'd just determined. The method yielded only coarse approximations, so Dr. Child was cautious in his estimates. But in reporting these observations, his awe at the scale of the phenomenon began to sneak into his technical report. As he wrote, "The swarm I estimated from 1/4 to 1/2 mile deep. It seemed like piercing the Milky Way of the heavens. My glass found no limits to them. They must have been a mile or more in depth." Well, like any good scientist, Dr. Child took his data and transformed the raw numbers into a complete picture of what he had witnessed. The mathematics were simple, but the results were nearly beyond imagination. When Dr. Child presented his straightforward calculations as to the aggregate size of the locust swarm passing over Nebraska, he was incredulous of his own findings. As he wrote, "They were visible from 6 to 7 hours of each of the successive 5 days, and I can see no reason to suppose that their flight was checked during the whole 5 days. If so, the army in the line of advance would be 120 hours by 15 miles per hour, 1,800 miles in length, and say even 110 miles in width, an area of 198,000 square miles, and then from 1/4 to 1/2 mile deep. This is utterly incredible, yet how can we put it aside?" The swarm was probably an elongated stream of insects, but if it had been configured into a more familiar geometric shape, it would have comprised a square 450 miles on a side. Imagine the entire state of Wyoming, border to border, blanketed beneath 3.5 trillion locusts, outnumbering the current human population on Earth by a factor of 600 to 1. Such quantities were unfathomable, but newspaper stories of damage across the West clearly substantiate Dr. Child's observations. If we find it difficult to imagine such a mass of life, it is even more challenging to grasp that less than 30 years after Dr. Child's account, the Rocky Mountain locust disappeared forever. At first, the disappearance of the locust was simply unbelievable, but an enticing explanation soon emerged. You see, a locust is a special kind of grasshopper, not a particular taxonomic group. The locust has a peculiar life history strategy, a sort of Dr. Jekyll to Mr. Hyde transmogrification that involves the capacity to change its anatomy, its physiology, its behavior in response to environmental cues, especially crowding. The gregarious or migratory phase is darker in color, has longer wings, and exhibits a propensity for aggregation, which accounts for its forming into dense bands of nymphs that then develop into vast swarms of adults. In the solitary phase, the locust is indistinguishable from a garden variety grasshopper. The initial theory of the Rocky Mountain locust disappearance was that the extinction was merely an illusion. The solitary phase was believed to still exist, but some change in ecological conditions simply prevented the appearance of the well-known gregarious form. And entomologists proposed various candidates for this solitary form, but despite heroic efforts to force a transformation, nobody could reincarnate the Rocky Mountain locust. In more recent times, analysis of the waxes comprising the locust cuticle. Now, these are hydrocarbons that comprise a sort of chemical fingerprint of each individual insect species. So these waxes, along with studies of DNA extracted from locust specimens that have been preserved in glacial ice, have confirmed that the Rocky Mountain locust was a true species, not simply the migratory form of some still existing grasshopper. So what could possibly account for the extinction of a species that had once blanketed 2/3 of the United States? For half a century, scientists proposed and then refuted a series of explanations. An acclaimed entomologist argued that a changing climate at the end of the so-called Little Ice Age in the late 1800s doomed the locust. However, others undermined this theory by pointing out that the thermal trend was too gradual to account for the extinction, and if anything, a warmer and drier climate should have favored the locust. A clever ecologist then argued that the locust depended upon the bison to break up the sod and overgraze the grasslands and thereby create a favorable habitat. So the loss of the bison meant the insects were destined to decline. But critics pointed out that the Rocky Mountain locust preferred to lay its eggs in compact, sandy soils. Moreover, bison would have competed with the insects for vegetation. Yet another scientist made the case that locusts depended on landscape alterations provided by the Native Americans, who had used fire to expand and maintain vast swaths of prairie. While forests did begin to encroach on grasslands following the extirpation of the indigenous people, the scope and rate of change were far less than what was necessary to account for the disappearance of the insect. There seemed to be no ecological change of a sufficiently large scale to account for the locust's demise. But therein lay the key. During outbreaks, the Rocky Mountain locust occupied nearly 2 million square miles. But the solution to its extinction was not the species ecology at the height of its flourishing. Instead, the answer lay in understanding the creature during the time of its most restricted distribution. As with other locusts, in most years, the climatic factors necessary to elicit an outbreak did not develop, and the populations eked out a living in highly restricted habitats where they could find adequate food for their bellies and suitable soil for their eggs. The fertile montane river valleys of the West were the locust's sanctuary and its Achilles heel. During its recession periods, it was constricted to an area of perhaps 1,000 square miles. The entire species would have comfortably fit into a circle of land less than 20 miles in diameter. Of course, the river valleys were not laid out in neat circles, nor were the locusts uniformly distributed. But no matter how we parse out the locusts and their habitats, the implication is the same. The species was regularly squeezed into a tight ecological bottleneck. When the outbreak of the 1870s collapsed, the locust became concentrated in these mountain valleys, and its timing could not have been worse. For these were precisely the lands that the pioneers sought to convert to agricultural production. Farming the river valleys of the Rockies became enormously profitable thanks to the burgeoning demand for food by the mining industries. Growing grain, not finding gold, held the key to sure wealth. And so it was that the locust sanctuaries were decimated. The soils where the insect concentrated its eggs were plowed and harrowed. To add insult to injury, large tracts of land were planted to alfalfa, one of the very, very few plants the locust could not abide. And to sustain this thirsty crop, farmers flooded the fields, drowning untold number of locust eggs. While upstream, beavers were eliminated along with their troublesome dams, so that spring floods washed away both eggs and hatchlings. And to make matters still worse, cattle and sheep were introduced into riparian areas, where their grazing widened the waterways, further exposing the insects to inundation, not to mention the destruction of egg beds through the trampling of the livestock. It sounds incredible that the most spectacular success in the history of economic entomology, the only complete elimination of an agricultural pest species, was a consequence of an unwitting bunch of frontier farmers armed with cows and plows. But consider a modern parallel, the monarch butterfly. Much like the locust in the late 1800s, this migratory species is poised for extinction. How could a butterfly that fills roadsides and fields from Texas to Maine be in jeopardy? Well, at the end of each summer, this species packs itself into a few pockets of fir forest in the mountains above Mexico City. Imagine having 30 or 40,000 butterflies in an area the size of your living room. Loosed on these sanctuaries, a logging crew could inadvertently put an end to this magnificent creature in a matter of a few weeks. Indeed, there is much to learn in modern times from the lessons of the Rocky Mountain locust. So we now find ourselves in a new frontier, an era of shifting conceptual landscapes and moral perils, a time of CEOs, scientists, conservationists, a time of grasping the consequence of our past, a time in which we wonder if our socioeconomic values are on a collision course with the constraints of the natural world, and what this will mean for us and other living beings. You know, the conservationists' argument that we must save species because we need their ecosystem services is rather feeble. The contention seems to suggest that the role of other species is somehow to assure our well-being and survival, or that most species actually do so. You know, in the eastern United States, the passenger pigeon and the American chestnut disappeared without a whimper. At some point, it is conceivable that we will so simplify ecosystems that we might no longer extract resources and services from them, but socioeconomic rationales for conservation, including yet-to-be-discovered cures for our illnesses, seem a bit disingenuous. These arguments are similar to speculations about all the financial rewards, official honors, social recognitions that would come from returning a lost wallet. The ultimate and perhaps compelling reason to return a wallet is that it's the right thing to do. Perhaps this also holds for why we ought to look after our fellow inhabitants of the earth. You know, my applied entomology textbook suggests that insect outbreaks are evidence of a disturbed or out of balance ecosystem. As with a well-behaved child or a good worker, species should refrain from extreme outbursts. This Victorian-era interpretation of the ideal emotional state may well be a social legacy of Darwin's uniformitarianism, an idea that emerged as a reaction to the Church's reliance on catastrophes to explain the history of the earth. Whatever the origin of this notion, and maybe it traces all the way back to the Greek ideal of the golden mean, the virtue of constancy has lived on in our perception that an outbreak or crash of a population is an unnatural aberration, an indication of a troubled species. But the leitmotif of the Rocky Mountain locust was its phenomenal flights of reproductive fancy, with manic swarms sweeping over the plains only to subsequently collapse into pockets of exhausted survivors. Evidence of this pattern was embedded in the annual layers of Knife Point Glacier, which revealed a pattern of locust outbreaks extending centuries prior to European alterations of the Western landscape. Erratic, even explosive population dynamics do not require anthropogenic disturbance, nor do they necessarily reflect dysfunctionality. Now, it is true that people, species, and ecosystems can manifest extreme dynamics during times of trouble, but all too often we are alarmed by nonconformity, not because of concern for another being, but because of our self-interest in having a predictable world, our socio-political intolerance of radicalism, our economic objective of slow but steady growth, and our Protestant ideal of moderation. Sometimes the outburst of joy from a child, the cry of anguish from a neighbor, or the outpouring of life by a species does not need to be fixed, controlled, or managed, but understood, accepted, and honored. Upon returning from our first expedition to the glaciers of the Rocky Mountains, my colleagues and I submitted a paper portraying what we had found at Grasshopper Glacier, north of Cook City, Montana. We described the location of the deposits, the types of insect parts we had extracted, the radiocarbon dating, and the analyses that led us to believe we had recovered the fragmented remains of the Rocky Mountain locust. As the first report of such a study in nearly 50 years, we hoped the manuscript would be well received. It was rejected. The editor of Environmental Entomology explained the study did not constitute a controlled experiment. Where were we supposed to find a controlled glacier? What experiment would we have done had we located such a resource? My appeal to the editorial board, the only time I've had the guts to take such a step, was denied with the incisive summary, and I have kept the letter. And I quote, "You have mistaken natural history for science." It seems, at least at that time, and perhaps still, that statistical design and controlled experimentation defined science for the research community. This suggested that initiatives such as the Human Genome Project, decidedly lacking a clear hypothesis, and NASA's deep space probes, utterly devoid of replication, are not science. It was as if nothing of value was left to describe in the natural world. A remarkable position for entomology, a field in which 90% of our fundamental units of study, that is insect species, are yet to be discovered. Even more disturbing was the notion that science required manipulation of the natural world rather than patient observation and thoughtful description. The Rocky Mountain locust is gone, and no experiment can retrace the events that led to its demise, explain the role it played in Western ecosystems, or reveal what other species may have perished along with it. Its tale will be told, if at all, to those willing to listen rather than those demanding answers. Although it required nearly 100 years, we finally resolved that the Rocky Mountain locust was a true species. But a greater question remains. The debate itself raises the issue of what constitutes a species, and it reveals our philosophical biases. We usually conceive of the world in terms of material things. For example, a species is a bunch of individuals. But this presumes the metaphysical truth of materialism, that to be real is to be made of matter. Ecology, however, is beginning to shift focus with tentative explorations of what the world would look like if process, rather than matter, was the basis for reality. Process, a term that came up frequently in the description of the composer and the art director. For the Rocky Mountain locust, it was the swarms, or more precisely, the process of swarming that constituted this remarkable species. This perception of the locust's essence is counter to the material terms in which we usually conceive the world. We normally define a species as a set of individuals with some shared qualities, typically the capacity to successfully interbreed. This orthodox definition equates being real with being made of matter. In this light, a species is the sum total of its members, the Rocky Mountain locust being comprised of trillions of bodies that washed over the continent like a living tsunami. A tsunami. A wave is not water. Our sense that a wave is a mound of moving water really is an illusion. The wave is the energy coursing through the fluid. The fluid is merely the observable evidence of that which surges within. A wave is no more the water than wind is trembling aspen leaves. And in this light, we might seriously doubt whether the monarch butterfly can be conserved within a refuge, a zoological garden, a vial of DNA, or a genetic sequence. If this species could not cluster against the chill rains of winter, could not sprawl into the milkweed patches of summer, what would we have conserved? What if a thing is what it does? What if we defined a species in terms of its life processes? In this light, the Rocky Mountain locust was an immense aperiodic energy flow that linked living systems across a continent. It died well before the last corporeal manifestation disappeared. Perhaps somewhere in the vastness of the Rocky Mountains, a remnant population of the locust clings to life within a fragment of habitat. But they would be no more their original species than a colony of monarch butterflies flitting futilely in a glass house. Unless the locust could once again blacken the skies, it would, in fact, be something else. Perhaps a Rocky Mountain grasshopper, but not the Rocky Mountain locust. Well, as you well know, the year 2002 passed without any recognition of its being the centennial of the material demise of the Rocky Mountain locust. There was neither mourning nor celebration of this biologically momentous event. Perhaps our willingness to overlook the passing of this species was a matter of blissful ignorance. For if we understood the story of its extinction, the implication for our environmental complacency would be most disturbing. The simplest and most unambiguous lesson that we can learn from the Rocky Mountain locust is that numerical abundance does not assure future survival. Having exceeded 7 billion people, we need only look back at the voracious swarms of the Rocky Mountain locust that blackened the skies of North America to realize that our future as a species is no brighter for our quantity. Being an abundant, polyphagous, and highly mobile species is no guarantee against extinction. There does, however, seem to be a major difference between our condition and that of the Rocky Mountain locust. This species had become wholly reliant on a place, requiring it to sacrifice other options and accept the risks of being profoundly and deeply linked to a landscape. For the locust, the fertile river valleys of the West were its sanctuary, a place where it could always find what it needed and persist in the face of adversity. The complex and intimate connections between the land and native species are difficult, perhaps impossible to express in objective scientific terms. But sacred places are central to the well-being of many creatures. Even with all the right conditions of temperature, light, humidity, and diet, animals often languish in zoos. They are unable to express what is missing, and perhaps we would be unable to understand. Well, unless we too had experienced the soul-wrenching loss of being forced from a farm or ranch that had been in the family for generations, or being driven from a homeland that defined our traditions, our stories, our hopes. Despite my deep understanding that the Rocky Mountain locust is gone as a species, I've searched for remnant populations in the irrational hope of meeting a few survivors. They may no longer be able to transform into the migratory phase, but I imagine that being in the midst of this noble creature might well transform me, much like being in the presence of a wise teacher. My surveys of grasshoppers in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem have yet to yield a specimen of this long-lost creature. But if I found a pocket of habitat still harboring the locust, regulatory officials might well advocate for their destruction, as the potential for a return to the swarms of the 1800s would be plausible. Even the vaunted Endangered Species Act exempts pests from protection. So perhaps this remnant population would be accorded the same status as the last vial of smallpox. I like to imagine that in an ironic peak, economic entomologists would point out that a remnant population of the Rocky Mountain locust that had not bothered us for a century could hardly be termed a pest. From the environmental camp, a few voices might call for protecting these insects as important components of a native ecosystem struggling to sustain biotic integrity. There might be some appeals to the Rocky Mountain locust capacity to serve as a reminder that we must share this world with other species, even those we have not tamed or controlled. And a few advocates would probably invoke the powerful place of this species in the story of the West and the folklore of America. But in the end, would our decision be any different from that being made by the people of Amazonia today? Or that which would have been made had the early pioneers realized that they had reduced their nemesis to a single locale? If we struggle so mightily with whether we should save the last bits of old-growth forest in the few untrammeled tracts of the Arctic, what hope would a locust have? What have we really learned about ourselves and our place in the natural world? Well, that's quite a story. And an opera is an ideal genre for epic narratives. So the tale of the Rocky Mountain locust would seem to beg for an operatic treatment. However, as a writer, I've learned that there's quite a long distance between having a great idea and producing a good piece of work. My role in Locust the Opera was that of the librettist, since the words of an opera are technically a libretto, although most folks would reasonably call them lyrics, making me a lyricist. But I think it's fun to be involved in a 400-year-old art form with its own terminology and traditions, so I'm going to be a librettist. In conceiving of the libretto, I had three major concerns. First, I wanted to be sure to capture the ecological richness of this story. The creatures of our western lands deserve to be treated with scientific accuracy. Next, I sought to explore the moral complexity of the events. On the one hand, the devastation by the locusts caused terrible suffering, so the loss of these creatures was a good thing. On the other hand, wasn't something of value lost with the extinction of this remarkable species? And finally, I wanted to tell a story. A great deal of research supports the value of embedding both information and questions in a narrative structure, as people are far more likely to access, to understand, and to remember what they have seen or heard when presented in a storied context. With these objectives in mind, I next faced three major challenges. First was the matter of distillation. I needed to condense my book of 100,000 words into a libretto of 1,350 words, a reduction of more than 98%. Next, it was necessary to take a story that involved dozens of personalities, from famous scientists to obscure settlers, and create just a few individuals to carry the richness of the narrative. And finally, I sought to foster a compelling aesthetic, a beautiful language that would unfold in the space between prose and poetry, between nonfiction and fiction. My strategy to address the concerns and challenges was to write through the perspective of three characters, manifesting in the blended archetypes of the magician sage, the heroic explorer, and the innocent orphan. These included the ghost of the Rocky Mountain locust, released from the rapidly melting glaciers of Wyoming in an entomological homage to Hamlet, which Franco Faccio transformed into an opera in 1865. The second character is the scientist, a hard-driving reductionist who is haunted by the locust's ghost until he can discover who or what caused the death of her kind. And the third character is a rancher, a man whose grandfather was driven from his farm by locusts, and tells the scientists a story that finally provides the qualitative insights necessary for the scientists to solve the ecological murder. And at the end of my story about the Rocky Mountain locust, I asked, what have we really learned about ourselves and our place in the natural world? This is a question sung by the ghost of the Rocky Mountain locust in the final scene of the opera. The story of the collision between this species and our own is a timeless tale of arrogance and humility. And perhaps never before in human history has it been more vital for us to come to terms with our own power and the responsibility regarding the natural world. Thank you. Yeah.
What are the plans for the opera after today?
Well, we will become rich and famous. No. Our immediate plan is to begin preparations to present this opera in Morocco. We've been invited and funded through a very twisted and beautiful tale of a wealthy Japanese entomologist who has underwritten the opera for presentation as a gift to the people of Africa. So we're presenting it in Agadir, Morocco in March as the opening of the International Congress of Orthopterology, which is a worldwide gathering of people who study grasshoppers, crickets, and locusts. So we will be there in March. After that, the world is wide open. We're working with some organizers at the International Congress of Entomology, which is a gathering of about 8,000 entomologists in Helsinki, Finland, where we would like, if anyone's got a big checkbook, let us know. We would like to find the funding to bring it there. We've got very partial funding. We would really, really like to share it in this region. We'd like to take it on tour in Wyoming. We'd love to take it down to the Front Range. We'd love to take it down into the desert Southwest. And as always in the arts, it's simply a matter of funding. We've got the costumes, we've got the set, we've got the talent, we've got the performers, and we're working hard to see if we can pull together the funding to take this to some more places, some different venues. Yeah.
I don't know how I have this impression, but doesn't the Bible suggest that locusts are cyclical and can disappear for longer than a century, say, and reappear with no explanation? And so the romantic person in me would like to think that on some of those melting glaciers there were eggs that had been blown in that direction and had been preserved somehow in the ice.
I like that. I'm a scientist turned philosopher turned writer, and so I've learned never to say no, that's not possible, especially when it comes to insects and the natural world. I think it's possible that there are remnant populations, whether they're contained in the glacial ice or they're contained in pockets of habitat, I don't know. I'm not sure about the Bible talking about centuries passing. Right, there is, and we know that with the desert locust of Africa, long periods of time can pass between major outbreaks, and there's a whole set of ecological conditions. Rainfall particularly drives that species. And so, yeah, there can be very long times, but this would be the longest period between outbreaks in the history of these creatures. But maybe, who knows what climate change portends.
So what other species were impacted by the extinction of assuming there's a trophic cascade, so where was it in the web and what else was impacted?
Well, that would require us knowing what the flora and fauna of the sparsely populated Rocky Mountain West looked like in the late 1800s, and we know so little. The one creature that we have some good circumstantial evidence that disappeared was the Eskimo curlew, which was a migratory bird that various ornithologists tell me likely exploited the outbreaks of the locust and fed heavily on their eggs. And with that food source gone, the timing and the ecology suggests that bird's disappearance. But there were probably many, many other creatures. Our best guess is when the locust disappeared, it sort of opened up a niche, an opportunity. And it was rapidly filled by some of the more less spectacular grasshopper species. Those enormous grasshopper outbreaks of the 1930s were Melanopus sanguinipes, called the lesser migratory grasshopper. Doesn't form, it actually forms kind of quasi-swarms. It's not a full-blown locust. But when that opportunity opened up, there were many grasshopper species waiting in the wings. Wyoming has 113 species of grasshoppers. And so I tell the ornithologists, if you guys want to do something difficult, right? learned to identify all the grasshoppers, right? The birds, big, slow-moving, lumbering creatures, not so hard. Move on to something challenging. So.
Just to follow up, so that the grasshopper swarms of the Dust Bowl were grasshoppers.
Those were actually
locusts,
grasshoppers.
And they didn't
Yep.
have the same kind of voracious appetite.
Well, they were hungry, but they just weren't as numerous. Yeah.
I mean, it was well described that they came through and what they did to the pioneers, but was there any description of the other ecological effects of their coming through, the bison having to eat, or, other creatures, not having enough food, at least for a couple of years, and what other effects did they have?
Yeah. So one of the effects that they had, well, one of the reasons why the damage to agriculture was so great, we think, is that extrapolating from contemporary locusts, one of the things that causes locust settling, so a swarm is passing over. So how does a locust know when to settle? They're very attuned to wavelengths in the yellow-green spectrum, which signal food. Right, and basically, we sent these great signals from our farms. Land here, right? And so a lot of the damage was to that. There was certainly rangeland native grasses that were stripped, but one of the things that was interesting is that the farmers who survived, if you will, these locust outbreaks, found that in the 2 years following, they had bumper crops, enormous levels of productivity, because the locusts left behind enormous amounts of nitrogen. Right? It was like getting a pulse of fertilizer into your soil. Didn't help you if you starved to death that winter, but the next spring, the arrival of the locust was absolutely good news in terms of the nutrient quality of those soils. So even what they stripped out, and we think of them as really do think of them as kind of a metabolic wildfire, right? And so we can burn off vast amounts of grass, and boy, it comes back with a flush, because a lot of those nutrients move back into the soil. So they really were kind of like a living wildfire. So whatever impacts they had were probably relatively limited in time, because the grasses had evolved to be heavily grazed, intensively grazed by bison herds, and probably by the locusts. And then to recover, having stored a great deal of nutrients necessary for recovering the roots, and then, of course, the surge of nitrogen fed those plants as well.
From what was described, was such a huge wave.
Yeah.
That would seem to me that you would have a whole stretch of country that was not able to support the wildlife that was there, at least for a year or until the next spring, and so you would just have a tremendous loss of everything else.
Well, you think that, but remember Albert Child's description is they flowed overhead for all of 5 days. They didn't settle, right? So that's when they're going to feed, right? If having locusts fly over is like an eclipse, right? It's cool, right? You can take pictures, people can send texts. Well, okay, not at that time, but it wasn't bad to have locusts pass over. It was bad to have locusts stop in. Yeah.
If you were lucky enough to find a little pocket of these somewhere, would you tell anybody?
I'm not telling. I did in the book, and well, there's an obligation to people to tell and an obligation to the creature to not tell. And I just love locusts more than people, so I might keep that to myself. Or if I found them, at the very least, right, I might present their bodies but not their location.
This is in regards to the starvation aspect of the pioneers at that time, and I'm just kind of curious as you're kind of looking at this. Of course, our crops are destroyed. There's nothing left. Our cows are starving out. Looking at that versus, wow, this is this amazing millions of pounds of protein just dropping into our farm, into the native communities that actually have a bonanza as far as feeding and saving all these things. And it was just really the pioneers' biases of not eating insects that allowed them to starve. I'm just curious where that.
No, you're absolutely right. So Charles Valentine Riley, probably the most famous entomologist in the history of entomology, was a key figure in the 1800s in figuring out this locust. He actually worked with chefs in St. Louis to develop recipes for the locust, given exactly what you're saying. They're incredibly high in both fat and protein. But we know that people will starve in the face of available food given various cultural biases, and there's very few indications that many people ever ate the locusts. Well, I should say there's very few indications that many European people ate the locusts. The native people, as you point out, I mean, locusts are, I mean, if you're growing crops, locusts are bad news, right? Because what you want to do is eat the crops, right? But, right, if you're a hunter-gatherer and the locusts show up, oh man, right, it's party time, right? This is good news. And we see that in the people of Africa as well, right? The people who move around or who are nomadic have welcomed the locusts. The people who grow crops do not. And it's similar there. They leave behind a great deal of nitrogen, but if you're a subsistence agriculturalist, right, it takes a year for that to begin to pay off. So yeah, they are an enormous, and there's good evidence. For instance, there was an anthropologist who compared the nutritional, let's see, what did he compare? Both nutrition and calories per unit effort of grasshoppers and dense outbreaks of grasshoppers and the Mormon cricket, right, to bison, right? And it turns out Native Americans would have been nuts, right, given the option to go hunt bison, right? They take a lot of energy, a lot of effort to process, and they fight back, which locusts don't. There's a great little story of evidence that a locust swarm landed in the Great Salt Lake. The locusts wash up onto shore, right? And then there's these windrows, piles of sun-baked salted locusts, right? Right? And there's evidence in some of the caves around there that they were scooped up in vast quantities by the native people. I mean, you had locust jerky, you know, for months. You know, tasty, crunchy, salty. You know, it kind of makes you hunger for lunch a little bit, right? No, you're right. They were a tremendous nutritional resource if you were willing to eat them and if you were willing to exchange agricultural production for a kind of gathering. Yeah.
Jeff, I was interested in how the story begins in Paul's introduction of your trip to Eritrea and to one of the places where drought and famine are common and people live often in marginal existence year to year. But I'm wondering how this last piece about the nutritional content of locust populations, does that change the advice that now you would give? Or is it just the sheer numeric swarm going through so devastating that you can't really change the advice you might give to a subsistence population?
Yeah, I mean, the problem is everybody has cultural barriers, right? So the people who have already accepted eating insects, and by the way, insects played a really important role in human history in terms of nutrition for us, and we sometimes forget that. So in the countries where the people are sort of pre-adapted or the culture is ready for locust consumption, that would certainly be a consideration. And there have been some really serious concerns about the use of various chemicals to spray locusts so that the locusts become contaminated, so the people who are gathering them are gathering, right, contaminated food sources. So I would certainly alter, and we're busy trying to alter our recommendations for the amount and types of insecticides. So at least those who are using them as a food source have a lower level of impact. You know, the amount of agriculture that we convert into livestock, which was, about 90% of the energy is wasted there, for our own feeding is pretty problematical. And so actually a conversion of a portion of our diet to insect consumption would be valuable. There's a lot of work now, it's recovering, right, this entomophagia, right, this eating of insects. And what some of the people are now finding is that instead of trying to feed people insects, given all the resistance, right, one of the limiting factors in livestock feeding is protein and lipids, right? So what they're talking about now is feeding insects to cattle, right? And then using the insects as a feedstock for livestock to then feed to us. And that seems to be maybe kind of a socioeconomic breakthrough that would allow mass production.